On the 4th of November 1975, the Moxley family say goodbye to their daughter Martha at First Lutheran Church in Greenwich. Among the mourners lurk 15 detectives, on the lookout for the murderer who may be among the grief-stricken people at the church. Although the police investigation has yet to make an arrest, there's some speculation about the Belle Haven residents are already swirling that autumn. And within a few months, Martha's mother Dorothy will be left wondering if one particular mourner that she comforted that day was in fact her daughter's killer. Welcome to True Crime with Morty, a podcast by a criminologist and her dog. I am your host TJ, and this is Morty. Each week we'll be doing deep dives into murders and mysteries from all around the globe, using my background in law and criminology to give a full account of true crime stories. If that sounds good to you, please consider subscribing, and thank you for joining us today. This episode is the second of 4, focusing on the mystery in Walsh Lane, the Martha Moxley murder. Martha was laid to rest on the 4th of November 1975, just days after she was found brutally murdered in her parents' garden. The town of Greenwich was left reeling from this shocking crime in what was considered to be one of the safest areas of the United States. Martha's case was national news, dubbed the golf club murder. It contrasted with the reputation of safety and beauty that Belle Haven had, and the fact the weapon used for a murder in one of the wealthiest places in America was a golf club. It made it seem like a farce. For the people of Greenwich, this was a tragic and confusing event, and worse still, Martha's murder played out publicly, putting the small town under scrutiny in the media. The Belle Haven residents were used to their privacy, but this national scandal made them the focus of both the public and the police investigation. Martha's funeral was obviously a hard day for her family. Her parents, Dorothy and David, and her brother John were sat at the front of the church, still in shock about the loss of Martha. Sat directly behind them were Martha's closest friends, 9 teenage girls who had got to know Martha in the year she had been living in Greenwich and were now completely distraught as they approached the coffin to lay 9 yellow roses on top. While Martha's family and community were saying their goodbyes, the police were using her funeral as an investigative opportunity. It was a chance to see if they could identify anyone who could be responsible. Statistically speaking, the majority of murder victims are killed by someone they know and have some form of relationship with, be it romantic, familial, or platonic. The US Bureau of Justice report that such connections between victims and their killers account for between 70 and 80% of all murders. So in the early days of the investigation, the police department always focus on those closest to the victim and then fan out to cover anyone who may be connected but is not among the immediate family and friends or a partner. They instead look at colleagues, neighbours, acquaintances, people like that. Which is why Captain Keegan of Greenwich Police spent Martha's funeral hiding outside the church between parked cars, filming the mourners, while his team inside were monitoring the reactions and behaviours of the attendees. After the service at the church, the Moxley family followed the hearse to Putnam Cemetery for a private burial. Chillingly, Martha is laid to rest under a large pine tree. The other mourners depart to the Moxley and Ix houses after the service. The teenagers of Belle Haven first head to the reservoir to get drunk and then head to McDonald's for food. Sheila Maguire remembers the guilt she feels partying when Martha isn't there to join in. Meanwhile, Christy Kaplan, who describes herself as being in a bit of a fog in McDonald's, is annoyed that Tommy Skakel is there joining the rest of the teenagers. She's even more confused at the Ix house later when she sees Sissy Ix chatting to Rushton Skakel. Did the adults not realise Tommy's involvement? The kids had already begun to suspect. The Moxleys did not know about the suspicions of the teenagers. They were busy with their grief. John, Martha's brother, describes attending her burial as an out-of-body experience and has only partial memories of the whole day. On returning to Belle Haven, Dorothy Moxley spent some time being comforted by the adults visiting and then went over to the Ix house to spend time with and comfort Martha's friends. This included hugging Tommy Skakel when he offers his condolences for her loss. 2 weeks after Martha's funeral was the annual Green Leaf Dance at Greenwich Academy Day School for Girls. Martha had planned to attend with Peter, as many of her friends were students at the school and had invited her to come. When Martha was murdered, a decision was made for Sheila and Peter to go together, which made them both understandably uncomfortable, but the consensus was that all the teenagers deserved to have some fun after so much tragedy. What is interesting about this dance is, much like at the funeral, people are already suspicious of Tommy. He attends with a date, and Martha's friends are irritated by his presence at the dance. Sheila, who had spent the night drinking to cope with her awkwardness of being Peter's date, was sat at a table with Tommy and was actually fearful of being sat near Martha's killer. Rumours about Tommy being a suspect would cause Tommy to change schools and withdraw from these social circles. The scrutiny on Tommy intensified within the community as the police progressed their investigation. Despite the police presence at the funeral and the suspicions rumbling among the teenagers, the investigation was initially focusing on outsiders. The police had thought that Martha's murder had to be the work of someone outside of Belle Haven. It seems that this was based less on the small evidence that they had and more on the presumption that the, quote, nice rich people of Belle Haven would not commit crimes like grisly murders. In 1975, the people of Belle Haven did not think the Greenwich police had actually solved a murder and assumed that they would be unable to solve this one. The Greenwich curse, as it was known, refers to a history of murders dating back to the 1600s that were either unsolved or mishandled. Nearly all of these murders were caused by a head wound. The Greenwich community privately felt that history was likely to repeat itself, and the curse would continue with Martha's death. Based on their flimsy analysis that the Belle Haven residents were unlikely to commit this crime, I would agree with the lack of faith in the police investigation. In fairness to them, though, they appear to have fallen for the typical mistake that we all make in society, thinking that rich people are automatically good and honest and hardworking, innocent. I think the last couple of years, as of recording, it's 2025, the last couple of years has really shown us all that the rich, famous, and even attractive are not necessarily nice or in fact law-abiding. But it is easy to see how intimidated the Greenwich police were, going up against their affluent and powerful residents. One of the many oddities of this case is that Detective Steve Carroll, one of the first detectives on Martha's case, was in Belle Haven the night of her murder. To supplement his income at the police force, Steve Carroll worked as a driver for a chauffeur company, and he was sent to Belle Haven on October 30th to collect Dr. Smith. Detective Carroll had driven Dr. Smith from Meadowood Drive, along Otter Rock Drive, and then out of Belle Haven approximately an hour before the murder, so technically he is another part of the mystery on Walsh Lane. However, Steve Carroll didn't see any kids on the street at this time. He said it was very cold and already dark, and the remnants of Mischief Night were decorating the trees. Carroll believed it was the perfect night for the murder. It was dark, there was no people around, and it was unusually quiet for Belle Haven. Except for the dogs being out there was no one to witness what happened to Martha. Having an additional job was pretty common among the police force in Greenwich, and being a chauffeur was one of the top jobs they had. And so you can imagine how awkward it was having to investigate these people when you knew them in a less formal setting from your other position. This was made worse by the fact the people they're questioning are connected to the most famous and powerful families in the country. Scarier still, they often didn't know who amongst the Greenwich elites were connected to the higher-ups in their own department. The police were also aware that any wrong question in an interview could lead to a team of fancy lawyers just swooping in, shutting it all down, and denying them access to witness and potential suspects. Which is precisely what happened. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start at the beginning of the investigation, the autopsy report. Martha Moxley's 6-hour autopsy was conducted by Connecticut State Medical Examiner Dr. Elliot Gross at Greenwich Hospital. Due to him having to travel to Greenwich, the autopsy was delayed until the 1st of November 1975. The use of a state medical examiner seemed a wise choice at the time, but the delay meant that he did not get the opportunity to view the crime scene, and that the time of death could only be narrowed down to between 9:30 on October 30th and 5:30 on October 31st. The police put the death around 9:45 to 10 p.m. due to the reports of barking and erratic dog behaviour on Walsh Lane. The Ix dog and another close neighbour dog were among those barking at this time, and both of them were facing the willow tree where Martha was killed. By 11 p.m, people were already looking for Martha, her mother, her brother, and later on the police, so it's very clear that the murder had to have happened closer to 9:30 p.m. than 5:30 a.m. Martha had multiple fatal wounds from her blows to the head. She'd been hit around a dozen times, causing bruises and cuts to her brain, and then she was stabbed in the neck. Dr. Gross concluded that the cause of death was a fractured skull. He also confirmed that she had not been raped despite the removal of her clothing, and that Martha had never engaged in penetrative intercourse, which was important information in the investigation, as you will see in the next episode. Here, though, is where things get a little odd. There were two unusual events that occurred at the autopsy. The first was that Officer Dan Hickman, who was one of the officers observing the process, was shocked to realise he had met Martha before. Officer Hickman did not know Martha personally and had not recognised her name or who she was at the crime scene. However, he had met Martha earlier that year at the beach. Martha had come up to talk to him while he was stationed at the beach in his police car, and he had a sudden shock when he realised the victim was someone that he'd met before. Officer Hickman's presence at that beach is important to note as it's relevant to one of the theories about Martha's case, so I will come back to him later. For now, we must address the troubling aspect of the autopsy, Dr. Elliot Gross's missing photos. During an autopsy, it is customary to take photos of the deceased and the autopsy process so that you log any evidence and injuries. Dr. Gross had taken some colour photographs of Martha and her injuries as part of his examination, which is completely normal. What was not normal was the way he was possessive of them as if they were his private property and not part of the overall autopsy report. I should point out that Dr. Elliot Gross is kind of a controversial figure. Years after Martha's murder, he was accused of falsifying autopsy reports to protect police from accusations of brutality. He was cleared of these charges, but he lost his job anyway due to the chaos his department was in at the time of these accusations. He continued to work as a medical examiner though, until he was temporarily banned after an investigation into one of his cases. In 2002 it was revealed that he'd labelled a death from natural causes as a homicide. During the final years of Martha's case being investigated, the colour autopsy photos were missing from her file, but that story is for another time. Let's now return to 1975 and the start of the investigation. While the police were beginning their inquiries, the Moxleys were beginning a new stage of life after losing Martha. In the winter of 1975, they were invited on a ski trip with their neighbours, the Skakels, to the chalet owned by the Skakels in the Catskill Mountains. John Moxley didn't know the Skakel children, and had not taken the rumours circulating about Tommy all that seriously, so he was excited to go skiing and hang out with some new kids. After the trauma of losing his sister, he had not been coping well, and he and his parents were still in the very early stages of their grief. He thought a ski trip would be a good change of scene for them. His parents reluctantly agreed, and they joined the Skakels on a day trip. However, John wanted to leave before the day was over. Having had no experience of the Skakel children prior to that trip, he had no idea what to expect. He immediately realised that he didn't like them, due to their attitude and behaviour. In Greentown by Timothy Dumas, John Moxley says of the Skakels, quote, "They were cocky and seemed to feel entitled to different treatment," end quote. John may not have liked the Skakels, but he was not convinced of them being potential murderers. Neither were the police, it seems. While the Moxleys started to distance themselves from their neighbours, the police found they needed to turn back their focus on the Belle Haven residents after going in a completely different direction. The hitchhiker, or outsider theory, was explored. In fact, it was the first stage of the investigation on the police report. They really considered the possibility that Martha was killed by an intruder who had visited Belle Haven on the night of the murder. There was no real evidence to support this theory. In fact, all the evidence at the crime scene pointed to it being someone who knew Martha and was either a resident of or connected to Belle Haven, rather than someone just passing through. In addition to the crime scene evidence, the geography of where Belle Haven is, not somewhere you would go by mistake, and the fact that it's a gated community and it has a private security firm with checkpoints for visitors and cars, this possibility that it was the work of a random killer decreases significantly. Weirdly, the locals agreed, so by the end of the first week, the police had already begun looking at people of Belle Haven closely and moved away from the hitchhiker theory. Let's look at some of the early police suspects. We'll start with Edward Hammond. Edward was a 26-year-old Yale graduate. He was a veteran. In 1975, he was attending Columbia University Business School in New York. He was home on the night of the murder, dealing with a recent bereavement, the loss of his father. On the one hand, Edward is a tall, handsome graduate student who's home visiting with his mother, grieving his father. But the people of Belle Haven were suspicious of him. He has been accused of odd and voyeuristic behaviour and described as an alcoholic. However, the police discovered that he's on medication that cannot be mixed with alcohol, so the reports of him are a little confused. His connection to the case is tenuous at best. Apparently, he was talking to Martha and her mother at a cocktail party a few days before the murder. and he was suspicious to police because his bedroom window overlooked the trees on the Moxley property where Martha was attacked. According to Detective Steve Carroll, if Edward Hammond had looked out of his window at the right time, he would have seen the whole crime occur, which made them suspicious that he'd not heard or seen anything. In fairness to Edward Hammond, it was a very cold, dark night. It was unlikely he would have stood next to his bedroom window, staring into his neighbour's garden. If he had heard anything connected to the murder, he may have assumed it was more about Mischief Night and not bothered to check. Still, they decided to check into Mr. Hammond and brought him in for questioning. He took a polygraph. In fact, he took 2 polygraphs, as the first one was inconclusive, and his medication that he was on was blamed for that. The second one he passed. They talked to his university. They also really searched his house and bins and removed lots of random items. I appreciate the thoroughness of making sure to cover all your suspects, but they really went after this guy to such an extent. It kind of looks weird when you compare it to the treatment of other suspects later on. Nothing about Mr. Hammond really went anywhere. His mother stepped in to protect him a little, as she felt he was being unfairly targeted. Mrs. Hammond also retained a lawyer for her son, but the police quickly eliminated him. Edward had one strange thing to tell them, though. A teenage girl had called his house 3 times and spoken to his mother, saying, "I saw Martha with Edward." Who this was, or why they called, is unknown. 2 more Belle Haven residents that faced scrutiny were Judy Sakowitz and Mark Keefe. Police noticed that their red car had been in an accident recently, and a red car was reportedly seen around Belle Haven on the night of Martha's murder. Was this the vehicle that hit the fence on Otter Rock Drive? And if so, was that connected to the murder? Nope. The car was literally a red herring. Both ladies had been out with friends in Westport the night of Martha's death and had crashed their car into their own house on the 6th of November. The red paint was still visible on the cottage wall when police visited them. They were also dismissed from the inquiry. The Belle Haven residents were suspicious of all their neighbours and in some cases people within their own home. In the weeks after Martha's murder, the police looked into many of the residents of Belle Haven. But one home and one family kept being brought up again and again, the Skakels. In addition to the rumblings around town about the Skakel family, there were 2 strange incidents involving anonymous contact with the Moxleys. Someone was hinting at a cover-up by the Skakels and the authorities. Among the many calls offering condolences to Martha's family, a strange call came through to the operator asking them to interrupt the Moxleys' phone call for an emergency. The person claimed to be an Irving Grossman from the Bronx, New York, and he claimed to know a Reverend Snow, advisor to President Ford. The operator puts the call through, where the caller proceeds to talk quickly and is hard to understand. Then, a few days later, David Moxley stops the police when they're visiting Edward Hammond to show them a letter he'd just received from New York. It was dated 6th of November and sent from Midtown Manhattan. The letter reads as follows. Dear Mrs. and Mr. Moxley, first of all, please accept my deepest and sincere condolences for the violent death of your nice daughter, Martha. I would be very surprised if you are ready to sacrifice your love of your Martha and lose your nice daughter by some demoralised, rotten boys from your vicinity. It is a shame for the whole nation and the state police in Greenwich and Connecticut that they want to cover the violent and cowardly crime of one girl which did not want to succumb to his sexy offers. It is a national shame how the police tried to cover up the crime and what they presented to the press. Who wrote about it in the New York Times and the Daily News? Who paid for the informations? The police should take into custody all the group of boys and girls that were together on that evening, and in 2 hours they would find who killed Martha. The police nor the press has the right to cover up the crime, even if the killer is the nephew of Mrs. Ethel Kennedy. Martha certainly was not going home alone from the party. 1 or more boys certainly accompanied her. Why hasn't the police followed through on this? If I were in your place, I would sue the state police for $5 million for insufficient investigation and being accomplice to the crime. With best regards, your friend. Was the letter sent by Irving Grossman, who claimed to be from New York, or from someone with insider knowledge of Belle Haven? The police deduced that English was not the first language of the letter writer, and that the writer had to be connected in some way to the, quote, rotten boys, to suspect them. The writer was also aware that the Moxley neighbours were members of the Kennedy family, and specifically that a nephew was involved in the crime, which was interesting, as Martha had spent the evening with the Skakel boys, who are, of course, Kennedy nephews. One person who could have written the letter, based on this criteria, was Franz Wittine, who was the driver and gardener for the Skakels and retired shortly after Martha's murder. He had worked for the Skakels for years, he knew the whole family very well, and had been at the house that night. Wittine will be relevant later, but staying on the subject of the letter for now, it is interesting that less than a week after the murder, someone is already talking about a cover-up. But the accusation is not levelled entirely at the police. It seems to implicate the Skakels themselves and the media as being involved in a conspiracy. Issues with the media reporting on this case will come up later as well. In the early days of the investigation, the police of course look at the boyfriend, Peter Ziluca. Although Peter was not in Belle Haven that night, he was a short drive away, and his alibi was his mother. Peter told the police that he, like many others that night it seemed, felt too nervous to go out. After his nap and had dinner with his mother, she offered to take him to see Martha, but he was scared to go out and it was freezing, all that stuff. So he stayed in. Later that night, his mother receives a call from Mrs. Moxley asking if they'd seen Martha. Peter was not too concerned at first. In a weird coincidence, he thought that she was with Sheila. Sheila, of course, had told her mother that Martha was supposed to be at Peter's when Mrs. Moxley had called them, and obviously both of them were mistaken. But Peter thinks that subconsciously he knew something was wrong, as although he slept that night, he felt like he hadn't slept, and he had all these confused thoughts about where Martha was. So in the morning, they receive updates that Martha is still missing. Later, they are horrified to learn that Sheila found her and she'd been attacked or raped, but it was under the impression that she was going to be okay. And then, of course, the worst call came in saying that she was in fact dead. The confusion and shock in the Ziluca house sends Peter meandering into the street, where he is almost hit by a passing vehicle. He barely notices and carries on walking down the street, wondering how this happened and if he could have stopped it, etc. He bumps into a friend on the street who asks him, "Are you okay?" To which he replies, "Martha's dead." The police polygraph Peter to confirm his story, and he passes, removing himself from their inquiries. So, after quite literally going around the houses, the Greenwich Police Department arrived back in ground zero of this case, the Skakel home and its residents. Due to their preliminary inquiries, police believed that Martha was killed between 9:30pm and 10pm, based on when the dogs were barking, and that sexual activity or a similar motive had to be part of why she was killed due to her state of undress. They knew that the autopsy confirmed that a rape had not taken place, but they felt the handprint on her thigh and her removed clothing indicated a related motive. The means to commit the crime had come from the Skakel home, and the last person seen with Martha, who may have had opportunity at the time, was Tommy Skakel. In our next episode, we will continue with our deep dive on the police investigation that spans 27 years and look at another suspect at the centre of this case, Tommy Skakel. But for now, thanks for listening to True Crime with Morty. Please like, comment, subscribe, and join us next week for our third episode of the mystery on Walsh Lane, the Martha Moxley murder. Goodbye from me, and goodbye from Morty.